Imagine the scene. It is the Omaheki Desert, 1904. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on the scorched earth. Across this unforgiving landscape, 60,000 people are moving. They are not an army on the march. They are a desperate tide of humanity, elderly men leaning on staffs, women carrying infants, children stumbling through the shifting sands. They are fleeing from the crack of rifles echoing behind them. German patrols are in pursuit, driving them deeper into the wasteland. Ahead, the only hope lies in the waterholes, but the order has already been given. The wells are poisoned. Survival is not an option. It is a miracle that will be denied to most. This harrowing image is not a scene from a fictional dystopia, but the grim reality of the first genocide of the 20th century. Decades before the horrors of World War II, the sands of Namibia became the testing ground for methods of mass extermination. Here, history witnessed a tragedy that would serve as a dark prototype for the Holocaust. Yet for over a century, the world remained largely silent. Between 1904 and 1908, the colonial machinery of the German Empire systematically destroyed up to 80% of the Herero people, between 40,000 and 80,000 souls, and 50% of the Nama people, claiming another 10,000 lives. It was a crime of such magnitude that it took until 2021 for Germany to officially recognize it as genocide. But before the bullets flew and the wells were poisoned, there was a slow, suffocating prelude: the theft of a homeland. Section 1. Land of Cattle. How the Herero lost their homeland, 1884-1903. To understand the magnitude of the loss, one must first understand what was taken. For the Herero people, the land was not merely soil to be owned. It was the land of cattle. In their pre-colonial existence, cattle were far more than livestock or economic assets. They were the beating heart of the culture, a measure of social status, a currency of exchange, and most profoundly, a sacred heritage linking the living to their ancestors. To possess cattle was to possess dignity. To lose them was to lose one's identity. The erosion of this world began in 1884, when the German flag was planted on the southwest coast of Africa. The colonization process was not an immediate military invasion, but a creeping paralysis induced by bureaucracy and deceit. The German administration, led by Governor Theodor Leutwein, adopted a classic imperial strategy: divide and rule. Leutwein cunningly exploited existing tribal tensions, pitting the Herero against the Nama and the various Herero clans against one another. He presented the German Empire as a benevolent protector, signing protection treaties with local chiefs. These documents, often written in languages the chiefs could not read or couched in ambiguous legal terms, were effectively death warrants for their sovereignty. Through these treaties, essentially frauds disguised as diplomacy, Germany laid claim to vast swaths of territory. However, the most devastating blow to the Herero way of life came not from a pen, but from nature, weaponized by the colonizers. In 1897, a catastrophic rinderpest epidemic swept through the region. The plague decimated the herds, wiping out the primary source of Herero wealth and nutrition. In the wake of this biological disaster, the German settlers pounced. Under the guise of vaccinations and aid, and utilizing the desperation of the tribes, the colonial administration accelerated the mass confiscation of land. The dynamic of power shifted dramatically. Destitute Herero, stripped of their herds, were forced to work for German settlers on land that had been theirs only months prior. A predatory credit system emerged. German traders would offer goods to the Herero on credit with exorbitant interest rates. When the Herero inevitably could not pay, the traders, backed by the colonial courts, seized their remaining cattle and land as collateral. This systemic theft was bolstered by a legal and social environment of absolute impunity. The German colonial courts operated with a blatant racial bias. Settlers were permitted to beat and even kill Africans with little to no legal consequence. A German man could murder a Herero servant and face a trivial fine, while a Herero who raised a hand in defense faced execution. This brutality was given a moral veneer by the missionaries present in the region. Rather than protecting the vulnerable, many missionaries spread and reinforced rumors of the Hereros' savagery and wildness. These narratives served to justify the harsh treatment and the looting of resources as a necessary step in civilizing the local population. By 1903, the land of cattle had become a land of barbed wire and German homesteads. The Herero watched as their sacred inheritance was fenced off, their pastures seized, and their social structure dismantled brick by brick. The cattle, the physical embodiment of their connection to their ancestors, were gone, taken by disease or decree. The governor's strategy of division had worked too well, leaving the tribes isolated and vulnerable. The humiliation was total. The Herero were no longer masters of the plains. They were refugees in their own country, pushed to the brink of existence. The fertile grounds for a violent explosion had been laid. The German administration believed they had broken the spirit of the Herero, viewing their silence as submission. They did not realize that they had stripped a proud people of everything except their rage, creating a powder keg that needed only a single spark to ignite. The spark in the powder keg, the uprising of Samuel Maharero, January 1904. The atmosphere in Okahanja at the dawn of 1904 was thick with a tension that could no longer be contained. For years, the Herero people had swallowed the bitterness of systemic humiliation, the memories of unpunished murders, the trauma of rapes committed by settlers against Herero women, and the daily degradation of servitude had coalesced into a singular, hardened resolve. The land of cattle had been stolen, but the spirit of the people remained, now fueled by an accumulated rage that demanded release. Picture the scene. Okahanja, nightfall. The flickering light of torches dances on the stoic faces of Herero warriors gathered in the shadows. Among them stands paramount Chief Samuel Maharero. The burden of leadership presses heavily upon him. He looks at his people and sees the stark reality of their future under German rule, a slow death in chains, or a quick death with a weapon in hand. The choice is no longer about negotiation. It is a binary choice between dying as a slave or dying as a free man. Maharero knows that once the order is given, there is no return. The bridge to the past is burning. The path ahead is stained with blood. The explosion, however, was not just a result of long-term oppression. It was triggered by immediate provocation and panic. In the days leading up to the outbreak, German officials began to circulate hysterical reports. Panic spread through the colonial administration like wildfire. They claimed that 300 fully armed Herero warriors had surrounded the fort at Okahanja, poised for a massacre. The reality, lost in the fog of colonial paranoia, was far more mundane and tragic. The Herero had gathered not for war, but for a peaceful discussion regarding questions of inheritance and tribal leadership. The spark that finally ignited the powder keg came from Lieutenant Zern, the district commander. Blinded by the rumors and the inherent racial fear of the savage, Zern misinterpreted the gathering. Whether through incompetence or malice, he ordered the first shots fired. That single act of aggression shattered the fragile peace. The preemptive violence by the colonizers confirmed Maharero's worst fears. Diplomacy was dead. On January 12, 1904, the uprising officially erupted. The rage that had been suppressed for decades poured out in a torrent of violence. The Herero struck back with devastating speed and ferocity. In the initial wave of the rebellion, between 123 and 160 Germans were killed. The targets were specific. The wrath of the Herero fell primarily upon German men settlers, soldiers, and traders who were seen as the agents of their misery. Yet even in the midst of this bloody insurrection, a profound distinction in conduct emerged, one that history often overlooks. While the German propaganda machine would later paint the Herero as bloodthirsty monsters to justify their own atrocities, the conduct of the uprising told a different story. The rebels deliberately spared women, children, and missionaries. This restraint was not accidental. It was a command from the top. Documents from the time capture the duality of Samuel Maharero's desperate strategy. In a letter sent to other Herero chiefs, his orders were chillingly clear, yet morally nuanced. "All Herero have risen," he wrote. "Kill all Germans. Do not spare anyone." But immediately following this decree of total war was a crucial exception. He explicitly forbade the killing of women and children. It was a desperate attempt to retain humanity in the face of annihilation, a code of honor maintained even as the world around them descended into chaos. The uprising was a shock to the colonial administration. The pacified subjects had bitten back. But as the fires burned in Okahanja and the news of the 123 dead Germans spread, the narrative was already being twisted. The Germans amplified the violence of the rebellion to mask the provocation by Zern and the peaceful nature of the initial gathering. The die was cast. The Herero had chosen to fight, sparking a conflict that would soon escalate from a colonial uprising into something far darker and more systematic than anyone in that torchlit night at Okahanja could have foreseen. The war had begun. Waterberg, the trap in the desert, August 1904. By August 1904, the chaotic skirmishes of the uprising had evolved into a calculated military operation. The German Empire, humiliated by the initial successes of the Herero, sent a response that left no room for ambiguity. General Lothar von Trotha arrived in the colony with a reputation for ruthlessness and a mandate that chilled even his fellow officers. He did not come to negotiate peace or to suppress a rebellion. He arrived with a singular, terrifying objective: the total annihilation of the enemy. The stage for this final act was set at the Waterberg Plateau. Here, the Herero people had gathered in mass warriors, women, children, and their remaining cattle numbering approximately 60,000 souls. They had converged in hopes of negotiation or, if necessary, a final defensive stand. But General von Trotha had no intention of accepting surrender. He viewed the conflict not as a colonial war, but as a racial struggle where mercy had no place. On August 11th, the Battle of Waterberg began. However, history reveals that this was less a battle and more of a corralling operation. Trotha's strategy was meticulous and sadistic. He deployed his troops to encircle the Herero encampment, closing off escape routes to the north, west, and south. Crucially, He left one specific avenue open, a gap in the encirclement leading southeast. This gap was not a tactical oversight. It was a death trap. The opening led directly into the Omaheke Desert, a vast, waterless expanse of deep sand and scorching heat. When the German artillery began to rain shells upon the encampment, panic ensued. The Herero, seeing the corridor left open by the German lines, poured into it. Tens of thousands of people, driving their cattle before them, fled away from the guns and straight into the waiting abyss of the desert. They believed they were escaping the battlefield, but they were running into a weapon far more efficient than the German Mauser rifles. What followed was a revelation of the true nature of Trotha's campaign. It is a little known but historically vital fact that this encirclement was planned in advance as a strategy of genocide. The escape was an illusion. As the Herero disappeared into the dust of the Omaheke, German soldiers were given strict orders not to let them return. They pursued the refugees to the edge of the desert and set up a perimeter. The military tactic had transformed into a grim manhunt. The German forces systematically occupied the waterholes on the desert's fringe, guarding them against any Herero desperate enough to turn back. Soldiers were ordered to fire on anyone emerging from the sands and to deny access to water at all costs. The interpretation of these events marks a horrifying shift in modern history. This was no longer war. It was a mechanized hunt for human beings. The desert itself was weaponized. Trotha knew that without water, the 60,000 men, women, and children driven into the Omaheke had no chance. The Battle of Waterberg was merely the mechanism to push a nation into a geographic gas chamber, ensuring that nature would finish the work the soldiers had started. The silence of the desert was about to be filled with the dying breath of a people. The Extermination Order, a document of death, October 1904. The logic of annihilation. By October 1904, the illusion of conventional warfare had vanished completely. The battle lines drawn in the sand at Waterberg had dissolved into a manhunt. General Lothar von Trotha, having driven the Herero into the Omaheke Desert, was not satisfied with military victory. His objective was absolute. He did not seek the surrender of a defeated enemy. He sought the erasure of a people. Trotha was driven by a cold, steely ideology of racial superiority. To him, the conflict was not merely a colonial dispute over land or cattle, but a racial struggle where the superior force must prevail over the inferior. He viewed the Africans not as human beings with rights to negotiation or mercy, but as subhumans standing in the way of German progress. Consequently, he categorically refused to enter into negotiations. The concept of a peace treaty was alien to his strategy. In his view, the only solution was the total removal of the Herero presence from the territory. The proclamation at Ozombu, Zovindimba, on October 2, 1904, at a waterhole known as Ozombu Zovindimba, General von Trotha formalized his intent. He issued the Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order. It was a defining moment in history, arguably the first official written order of genocide in the 20th century. The proclamation was read out to the troops and printed for distribution. Its language was chillingly precise, leaving no room for interpretation by the soldiers who would enforce it. Trotha wrote, "I, the great general of the German troops, send this letter to the Herero people. All Hereros must leave this land. If the people do not do this, then I will force them to do it with the great guns. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children. I will drive them back to their people, or I will let them be shot at. This document stripped an entire ethnic group of their right to life. The distinction between combatant and civilian was erased. The inclusion of the phrase "with or without a gun" gave license to murder unarmed men. The refusal to accept women and children and the order to drive them back into the desert or fire over their heads to terrify them ensured that those who did not die by the bullet would die by the elements. The radius of death. The order was not empty rhetoric. It was backed by a meticulous military cordon. German patrols were stationed along the edge of the desert, sealing off a perimeter that extended for 250 kilometers. Their orders were explicit: prevent any Herero from returning to the habitable lands. The desert became the weapon. The Omaheke is a landscape of unforgiving heat and scarcity, but survival might have been possible for the Herero, who knew the land, had it not been for the systematic poisoning of the water sources. Under Trotha's command, soldiers located the few precious water holes in the region. They guarded them to shoot anyone desperate enough to approach, and when they moved on, they poisoned the wells, chemically ensuring that the land itself became uninhabitable. It was a strategy of absolute destruction. The brilliance of military logistics was perverted into a machine of mass murder. The Herero were trapped in a vast open-air prison where the walls were made of thirst and the guards were German rifles. The diplomatic facade. While the sands of the Omaheke were filling with corpses, the brutality of Trotha's methods eventually reached Berlin. The sheer scale of the atrocity began to cause unease, not necessarily out of moral objection, but due to political calculation. Rumors and reports filtered back to the German Chancellery. Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow became concerned. However, historical analysis suggests his concern was not rooted in humanitarianism. Bülow feared an international scandal that could damage Germany's reputation among other colonial powers and the domestic electorate. The image of German soldiers slaughtering defenseless women and children was bad for prestige. Under pressure and fearing a diplomatic disaster, Bülow advised Kaiser Wilhelm II to intervene. The order was eventually countermanded. The emperor ordered that the absolute killing should stop and that mercy should be shown, but it was a twisted form of mercy. The directive to shoot on sight was rescinded, but the intent to destroy the Herero social structure remained. Trotha's command to execute everyone was replaced by a new policy. The survivors were to be rounded up. They were no longer targets for immediate execution, but were instead destined for the newly established Konzentrationslager, concentration camps. The Vernichtungsbefehl had done its work. The surviving population was shattered, starving, and broken. Now, the colonial administration prepared to extract the last measure of utility from their bodies through slave labor. The methods pioneered by Trotha, the dehumanization, the refusal of quarter, the use of harsh environments as a weapon, and the bureaucratic language of extermination did not vanish in the Namibian desert. They were studied. They set a dark precedent. Decades later, these very tactics would be revisited and refined by a new generation of ideologues in Europe who look back at the efficiency of the German colonial machine in Africa with admiration. Section 5. The Nama Uprising. War on two fronts. 1904-1907. The old lion awakens. Just as the silence of death was settling over the Omaheke Desert, a new storm broke in the south. The German colonial administration, believing the native problem was nearing a brutal conclusion with the Herero, was caught entirely off guard. On October 3, 1904, merely 24 hours after General von Trotha signed the infamous extermination order for the Herero, the Nama people declared war. The architect of this new front was not a reckless youth, but a man of immense gravity and history, Captain Hendrik Witbooi. At 70 years old, Witbooi was a legendary figure in Southwest Africa, a literate, devout Christian, and a seasoned strategist. He had long navigated the treacherous currents of colonial politics, even serving as an ally to the Germans under previous treaties. But the events of 1904 shattered his illusions. Watching the annihilation of the Herero, Witbooi realized that friendship with the colonizer was a death sentence. In a moment of profound historical weight, the white-haired warrior mounted his horse once more. Amidst the jagged rocks and dry riverbeds of the south, he gathered his people. Witbooi knew the odds. He knew the might of the German machine. Yet, at the end of his life, he chose to die as a free man with a weapon in his hand, rather than live as a subject of a regime that viewed him as livestock. The War of Phantoms. The conflict that followed was fundamentally different from the Herero War. The Herero had fought as a nation on the move, encumbered by families and cattle, making them vulnerable to encirclement. The Nama, however, waged a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. They knew the terrain, the rocky canyons, the scorching plateaus, and the hidden springs better than any mapmaker. Under Witbooi's command, the Nama commandos struck fast and vanished before the Germans could return fire. They targeted supply lines, isolated patrols, and infrastructure. It was a war of phantoms. The heavy German columns, accustomed to static European warfare and encumbered by artillery, found themselves chasing shadows. For a year, the 70-year-old captain outmaneuvered the professional army of the German Empire, turning the landscape itself into a weapon against the invaders. The second order of death. Frustrated by an enemy he could not crush in open battle, General von Trotha reverted to the only strategy he seemed to trust: total extermination. The hero of the Waterberg could not accept a stalemate against what he considered an inferior race. On April 22, 1905, Trotha issued a second proclamation, chillingly similar to the one that had condemned the Herero. This document was directed specifically at the Nama. He warned that those who did not surrender would be shot and that no quarter would be given. It was an admission of military failure. Unable to defeat the Nama tactically, the German command decided to destroy them existentially. The order signaled that the genocide was not an isolated event against the Herero, but a systemic policy applied to any African people who resisted German rule. The fall of the captain. The resistance held strong for over a year, driven by the charisma and tactical brilliance of its leader. However, the end came not through a decisive German victory, but through the chance of war. On October 29, 1905, during a raid on a German transport column near Valgras, Hendrik Witbooi was wounded in the thigh. For a man of 70, living in the saddle and fighting a guerrilla war, the wound was fatal. He died shortly after, surrounded by his loyal followers. In a final act of defiance, his soldiers buried him in a secret, unmarked grave in the bush. They knew that the Germans, obsessed with racial science and trophies, would seek to desecrate his body and send his skull to Berlin for study, a fate that befell many other African leaders. To this day, the resting place of the legendary captain remains part of the landscape he died defending. The long shadow. With the death of WWII, the heart of the rebellion was pierced, although the Nama continued to fight, driven by the knowledge that surrender meant the concentration camps. The unified resistance fractured into smaller, isolated bands. The war ground on, bloody and desperate, until it was officially declared over in November 1907. The Nama had fought a war on two fronts, against the German army and against the inevitability of their own destruction. While they inflicted heavy losses on the colonial forces, the cost was catastrophic. By the time the guns fell silent, the stage was set for the final, grim chapter of the colonial project, the camps, the island of death, the concentration camps of German Africa. 1905-1908, the birth of a term. As the dust settled on the battlefields, the German colonial administration faced a logistical question: what to do with the defeated? The answer was found in a new, sinister institution. Official German telegrams began to use a specific term to describe the enclosures erected for the survivors: Konzentrationslager, concentration camps. It was here, in the sands of Namibia, decades before the rise of the Third Reich, that this term entered the German lexicon of oppression. These were not prisoner of war camps in the traditional sense. They were instruments of passive extermination. The goal was no longer immediate execution by a firing squad, but death through labor, exposure, and starvation. The Herero and Nama, who had survived the desert, were herded into these enclosures to build the colony that had destroyed them. Shark Island, the geography of hell. The most notorious of these camps was located in the harbour town of Lüderitz, on a bleak, rocky outcrop known as Shark Island, Haifischinsel. It was quickly rechristened by the locals as the Island of Death. The geography of Shark Island was a weapon in itself. Connected to the mainland only by a small causeway, the island was completely exposed to the freezing winds of the Atlantic Ocean. The prisoners, accustomed to the dry heat of the interior, were packed onto the bare rocks without shelter, blankets, or warm clothing. The cold was relentless. The statistics of Shark Island testify to its true purpose. Of the approximately 1,700 Nama prisoners, including the families of the guerrilla fighters sent to the island, it is estimated that 80% perished. They died of pneumonia, scurvy, and typhus, their bodies thrown into the shark-infested waters or buried in shallow graves in the sand. It was a death sentence, carried out by nature, orchestrated by man. Swakopmund and the ration of starvation. In other camps, such as the one in Swakopmund, the focus was on forced labor. Women, often yoked together like cattle, were forced to pull carts and carry heavy loads to build the colony's railways and harbors. The physical exertion was lethal when combined with the official rations. The daily allowance for a prisoner consisted of merely 0.5 kilograms of raw flour or rice. Without pots or fuel to cook, the prisoners mixed the flour with cold water and ate it raw. The result was mass dysentery and slow, agonizing death. In Swakopmund alone, the mortality rate hovered around 40%. The prisoners were worked until they collapsed, at which point they were simply discarded. The laboratory of genocide. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Namibian concentration camps was their role as a laboratory for racial science. The camps attracted the attention of German academics eager to prove their theories of Aryan superiority. The horrors of Shark Island were compounded by the presence of doctors who saw the dying prisoners not as patients, but as specimens. Hundreds of skulls of the victims, Herero and Nama alike, were severed from their bodies. These remains were packed into crates and shipped to universities and museums in Berlin for evolutionary research and craniometric measurements. It was in this environment that Dr. Eugen Fischer arrived to conduct his field studies. He focused on the Rehoboth-Basters, children of mixed German and African descent. Fischer subjected these children to humiliating physical examinations and measurements, seeking to prove that mixing races resulted in physical and mental degradation. The shadow of the future. The work done in these camps did not end with the closure of the colonial era. Eugen Fischer's research in Namibia became the foundation of his 1913 book, The Principles of Human Heredity and Race Hygiene. This text would later be read with great interest by Adolf Hitler while he was imprisoned in 1923. Fischer eventually became a leading figure in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin, where he taught and mentored a young student named Joseph Mengele. The line connecting the windswept rocks of Shark Island to the gas chambers of Auschwitz is direct and undeniable. In Namibia, the methods of dehumanization, the bureaucracy of the concentration camp, and the pseudoscience of eugenics were tested and refined. Artistic sketch. The measure of a man. Imagine the scene on Shark Island. The Atlantic wind howls, whipping sand against the raw skin of the dying. There are no walls, only the sea and the wire. A woman sits huddled against a rock, too weak to shiver. Nearby, a German doctor stands over a corpse. He is not there to mourn or to heal. He holds a pair of calipers. With cold, clinical precision, he measures the dimensions of a skull for a textbook that will one day be used to justify the burning of Europe. The scratching of his pen on paper is the only sound louder than the wind. Figures of silence. What remains? 1908, present. The peace of the graveyard. On April 1st, 1908, the gates of the concentration camps were officially opened. But for the Herero and Nama, this was not a liberation. It was a transition from enclosure to enslavement. The war had ended, but the nation was dead. The statistical reality of the genocide is staggering, even a century later. Between 1904 and 1908, the German colonial machine had annihilated approximately 80% of the Herero population. Estimates range from 65,000 to 80,000 people, and 50% of the Nama, around 10,000 to 20,000. Those who walked out of the camps were ghosts. They had no cattle, no land, and no rights. The German administration had confiscated all tribal territories. By imperial decree, the survivors were barred from owning land or livestock. They were forced to carry metal identification discs around their necks and were distributed as forced laborers to the very settlers who had hunted them. The proud pastoralists, whose culture was defined by the freedom of the horizon, became a servant class in their own home. The long century of denial. For most of the 20th century, a heavy silence hung over the Namibian desert. While the world recoiled in horror at the Holocaust in the 1940s, the prototype in Africa remained buried in colonial archives. The skulls of the victims gathered dust in the storage rooms of German universities and museums, catalogued not as human beings, but as scientific specimens. It was not until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, driven by the activism of Herero and Nama descendants, that the silence began to fracture. The demand was simple: the return of the remains and the acknowledgement of the crime. The repatriation of skulls from the Charité Hospital in Berlin in 2011 and subsequent years was a somber spiritual victory, yet it highlighted the grotesquerie of the past ancestors returning home in boxes, victims of a science that denied their humanity. A hesitant apology, 2021. The diplomatic struggle for recognition culminated only recently. On May 28, 2021, 117 years after the slaughter began, Germany officially recognized the atrocities committed in Namibia as genocide. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas stated, "We will now officially call these events what they were from today's perspective, genocide." However, this admission came with caveats that sparked fury and disappointment among many descendants. Germany pledged $1.1 billion in financial support over 30 years for infrastructure and development projects, yet the government was careful to frame this as reconstruction and development aid rather than legal reparations. This distinction was crucial for Berlin to avoid setting a legal precedent for other colonial crimes. But for the Herero and Nama, it felt like a final insult, a payoff without true liability. The living scars today, the legacy of General von Trotha's order, is still written on the geography of Namibia. While the German Empire is long gone, the economic disparities it engineered remain. A significant portion of the arable commercial farmland in Namibia is still owned by the descendants of European settlers, while many Herero and Nama live in poverty, crowded into communal lands or urban shantytowns, alienated from the soil that was once their birthright. Historians continue to debate the true toll. Some argue that the figure of 100,000 dead is conservative, suggesting that the chaos of the desert and the unrecorded deaths in the bush mean the true number will never be known. The precise arithmetic of death is impossible to calculate. The census of 1904 was written in blood, and the records are incomplete. Final sketch: the wind over the Omaheke, Namibia, present day. The sun beats down on the Omaheke Desert with the same indifference it showed in 1904. To the tourist's eye, it is a landscape of stark, breathtaking beauty-red dunes rolling into infinity, silence stretching to the horizon. But the sand remembers. Beneath the shifting dunes, bleached by a century of heat, lie the bones of those who did not make it to the wells. There are no headstones here. No names are carved into the rock. The wind picks up the sand, whispering through the thorn bushes, carrying the dust of a 60,000-strong exodus that vanished into the void. It is a deafening silence. It is the sound of a genocide that the world tried to forget, echoing in a land that can never forgive.